Good morning again. It's part Soundoff 2022. Better confused with that 2023. Car, look at me. Don't even know what year is. So still the same day. Actually, not very long after I just finished making the last video. Still doing the old comics work, so no screen sharing. However, as I was watching back that video, just to make sure it wasn't too atrocious, whilst I was doing some work, literally, as I was singing the praises of Wacom and Photoshop finally working as one, what happens? But pressure sensitivity dies. And I'm like, oh, expletives. Yeah, that was a fun, interesting little piece of digital karma that happened. That'll teach me for singing your praises, Wacom and Photoshop. Luckily fixed it easily just by restarting Photoshop. It's actually, I think, it didn't like me replaying a video in Windows Movie Maker, which, let's be honest, probably isn't the best program for making movies with. But it is what I have for doing this right now. So yeah, that was something I felt I had to share before I forgot about it. And also, depth of field. I've got a topic because it just struck me, something to talk about, because I'm actually dealing with it. Depth of field, not something that I feel I've ever really talked about before, but in comics it's very important, depth of field, and there's many ways you can affect it, and it can be quite tricky sometimes and it can be easy sometimes. It's something that when you're kind of starting out, it's easy to think that's taken care of with the perspective the artist puts in, but you do add an awful lot to, or take an awful lot away from, the depth of field as a colorist, because you're choosing the color, just the color itself, for instance. You're then choosing the value of that color, and every color has a value range, and then you're also choosing the saturation. You're choosing how to modify the local colour that you want a thing in order to adapt the value ranges that you want to bring in, etc, etc, etc. So what do I mean by that? If you haven't really thought about this stuff very much, you might find this interesting. If you have, probably turn this off, because you know everything I'm about to say already, and I may say a few things you think, ooh, I think about that a bit differently. So don't get angry if you know a lot about anything about it. This might be interesting. So choosing your colour, that can affect the depth of field, because every colour has a local set of values that are associated with it. So red is a dark colour. So look at red in a grayscale, it's going to be pretty dark. It's going to be black, dark grey. If you manage to get a light grey that's also a red, that's not printing. You might be able to do it using some on-screen digital trickery potentially. But even a bright RGB only red is still not going to come out particularly light in a grayscale conversion. So that means it's dark. Likewise, green, a surprisingly tricky colour to work with, because green can run the gamut, really, of light to dark, can be extremely broad, and it's actually very easy to really mess up your ink levels with green, because you're thinking you're just making a nice, strong, regular green, but you look at that in your little information window in Photoshop, your CMYK info, way over that limit that you want to be setting for your ink levels. Really, if you don't know this, when you're making a comic, if you plan to print it, the ink levels you're looking for with your colours, so not your black line areas or black shading, but your colours, you're really looking to be maxing out at 200 in order for a kind of decent print that's going to be pretty clear. And within that, 200 is obviously where you want your darkest parts of the page to be. aside from the blacks. That means that your blacks will still have some power to them if you're kind of limiting yourself to the 200. And you know, you can edge over that line like the speed limit on a motorway. You can edge over, but you don't want to be braking regularly or with great ferocity. Yeah, you've got that as your starting point. You then obviously within that spectrum of deciding what colours to put next to each other, and sometimes you're not really making a decision. For instance, say you have green skinned characters in a forest. Say the Hulk and She-Hulk are hanging out on a mission and they're in a forest. Well, there's probably going to be a lot of green on that page, right? But you've got to make sure that that forest still has depth of field to it, and you might have Hulk and She-Hulk be different shades of green, which will help to separate them a bit. But, you know, in my experience, Hulk tends to be somewhere in the region of an emerald to a blue-green. Obviously, he's had lots and lots of different things, but generally, you know, I'd put the Hulks in that kind of range. They probably tend to be less on the yellow-green side, in my experience. More edging towards the blues. I'm not getting into any discussion around that. If you think differently, fine. I honestly, don't talk to me about it. I don't care. It's just off the top of my head example. My point is, if we're going to say they're in the blue-green spectrum, flip this around if you want it to be the opposite. Then in your forest, you're going to probably want them being more of a saturated level regarding the forest around them. So the forest you may have desaturated, and also you may want to make sure that, although obviously some areas of the forest will be in shadow, which will mean that the blue-greens will be more appropriate, you may find that maybe there's some helpful sun rays coming through behind the Hulks and putting in some very lovely yellow-green to help them pop. Or alternatively, maybe there's some of those lovely plants that have red leaves. They're very helpful, especially if you need a desaturated area behind them. Or, you know, when things get proper murky, proper shadows, head into the blues, right? Just because it's meant to be a green local colour, sometimes you'll end up with blues or greys out there behind them. So, you know, you got to use these tricks to work on your depth of field. And likewise, obviously, if you've got a lot of separation between, say, the Hulk and She-Hulk in space, one is much further away than the other, then you can again play with saturation. You can bend that green away from green into the blue, or into the, you know, however you want to, in order to push the depth of field again. And provided your highlights are consistent throughout, and you're kind of applying a consistent shadow colour from the light source, etc., then you'll find that you can actually make blue look green if you need it to. In fact, you can do the Hulk purple in the right circumstance and have it not be a printing error, and he'll still look correct. It's just about kind of following that kind of internal logic within the rest of the scene as to where the colours are playing out and where you're forcing perspectives with colour, and enhancing your depth of field. And so, yeah, you kind of like have this, I guess, responsibility as the colourist to think about your saturation levels and your colour strength and your local colours, and how maybe, you know, you're going to like bring in some mud instead of the grass because that's going to help things pop over here and like help to separate some characters there. Maybe you need some mist, so you can put in a special effects layer. Maybe you need to knock back some distant stuff because all of the line weights are quite similar, and those mountains, they're really too prominent. They need to be really in the distance. You could use maybe a screen layer over the line work, or you could just hold the line work and push it back that way. It's probably a easier way of doing it in those kinds of circumstances. But yeah, so lots of things to think about with the depth of field. And when you obviously are moving away from a monotone, well, more monotone local scenario at least, where you have the Hulks in a forest, then obviously there's a lot more you can play with when you start putting different characters in different scenes, where you can actually start really mixing up the colours and using greens against reds or blues and yellows and all these kinds of things, and then making different interesting combinations with triads or you name it, all kinds of stuff can be achieved. But depth of field is something to really think about, and so what I would recommend is before you finish your page, and as you're going through, if you're using Photoshop or an equivalent program, obviously it's a lot harder with crayons or pens or paints or something that are in the real world, but you can obviously, I think in most programs, flip on your proof colour, and I always have my proof colour set to grayscale, which allows me to very quickly just check how's the depth of field looking, because your depth of field is essentially how does it look in grayscale. You want to try and separate the foreground, midground and background in your grayscale with whichever setup is appropriate for the effect you're trying to achieve. So I mean, there's no particularly correct way of doing it, in the sense of like it has to be darker here and lighter here, but you know, it really comes down to time of day, location, character, mood, all this kind of stuff, personal style. Yeah, but I would recommend setting your proof colours to grayscale so you can do a quick flip. And if you are relatively early in your journey, I would also recommend occasionally checking your proof colours as CMYK if you intend to print, because there can be a very large difference between the RGB display and the print display. If you're not used to working for print in RGB, then it's worth keeping an eye on that until you get more of a feel for it, particularly in the purples, magentas, and more vibrant versions of things like red and green as well. Anyway, that'll do. Depth of field. Well done me, a proper topic. Look at that. I've talked about art. Yeah. Alright, maybe I think that's probably going to be it for recording this morning, and maybe I'll do something this afternoon while I'm doing some 3D work at some point to do another one. I'm not going to watch this back, I'm just going to post it, because if I watch it back I won't be able to work. So hopefully it's not awful, but if it is, sorry, turn it off. Alright, bye!